Chapter 11 of The Secret Passage by Fergus Hume. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you today by Dawn Larson in Minnesota. The Secret Passage by Fergus Hume, Chapter 11. On the Track. Professor LeBeau kept a school of dancing in Pimlico, and incessantly trained pupils for the stage. Many of them had appeared with more or less success in the ballets at the Empire and Alhambra, and he was widely known amongst star-struck aspirants as charging moderately and teaching in a most painstaking manner. He thus made an income which, if not large, was at least secure, and was assisted in the school by his niece Peggy Garthorne. She was the manager of his house, and looked after the money, otherwise the little professor would never have been able to lay aside for the future. But when the brother of the late Madame LeBeau, an Englishwoman, died, his sister took charge of the orphan. Now that Madame herself was dead, Peggy looked after the professor out of gratitude and love. She was fond of the excitable little Frenchman, and knew how to manage him to a nicety. It was to the dancing academy that Jennings turned his steps a few days after the interview with Susan. He had been a constant visitor there for 18 months, and was deeply in love with Peggy. On a bank holiday he had been fortunate enough to rescue her from a noisy crowd, half drunk and indulging in horseplay, and had escorted her home to receive the profuse thanks of the professor. The detective was attracted by the quaint little man, and he called again to inquire for Peggy. A friendship thus inaugurated ripened into a deeper feeling, and within 9 months Jennings proposed for the hand of the humble girl. She consented, and so did LeBeau, although he was rather rueful at the thought of losing his mainstay. But Peggy promised him that she would look after him until after he retired, and with this promise LeBeau was content. He was now close on 70, and he could not hope to teach much longer. But, thanks to Peggy's clever head and saving habits, he had, as the French say, plenty of bread baked to eat during his days of dearth. The academy was situated down a narrow street far removed from the main thoroughfares. Quiet houses belonging to poor people stood on either side of this lane, for that it was, and at the end appeared the academy, blocking the exit from that quarter. It stood right in the middle of the street, and turned the lane into a blind alley. But a narrow right-of-way passed along the side and around to the back, where the street began again, under a new name. The position of the place was quaint, and often it had been intended to remove the obstruction, but the owner, an eccentric person of great wealth, had hitherto refused to allow it to be pulled down. But the owner was now old, and it was expected that his heirs would take away the building and allow the lane to run freely through to the other street. Still, it would last Professor LeBeau's time, for his heart would have broken had he been compelled to move. He had taught there for the last 30 years, and had become part and parcel of the neighborhood. Jennings, quietly dressed in blue serge with brown boots and a bowler hat, turned down the lane and advanced towards the double door of the academy, which was surmounted by an allegorical group of plaster figures designed by LeBeau himself, and representing Orpheus teaching trees and animals to dance. The illusion was not complimentary to his pupils, for if LeBeau figured as Orpheus, what were the animals? However, the hot-tempered little man refused to change his allegory, and the group remained. Jennings passed under it and into the building with a smile which the sight of those figures always evoked. Within, the building on the ground floor was divided into 2 rooms, a large hall for dancing lessons, and a small apartment used indifferently as a reception room and an office. Above, on the first story, were the sitting room, the dining room, and the kitchen, and on the third, under a high conical roof, the 2 bedrooms of the professor and Peggy, with an extra one for any stranger who might remain. Where Margot, the French cook and maid of all work, slept was a mystery. So it will be seen that the accommodation of the house was extremely limited. However, Le Beau, looked after by Peggy, and Margot, who was devoted to him, was extremely well pleased and extremely happy in his light, airy French way. In the office was Peggy making up some accounts. She was a pretty small maiden of 25, neatly dressed in a clean print gown, and looking like a dewy daisy. Her eyes were blue, her hair the color of ripe corn, and her cheeks were of a delicate rose. There was something pastoral about Peggy, smacking of meadowlands and milking time. She should have been a shepherdess looking after her flock, rather than a girl toiling in a dingy office. How such a rural flower ever sprung up amongst London houses was a mystery Jennings could not make out. And according to her own tale, Peggy had never lived in the country. What with the noise of fiddling which came from the large hall, and the fact of being absorbed in her work, Peggy never heard the entrance of her lover. Jennings stole quietly toward her, admiring the pretty picture she made with a ray of dusky sunlight making her hair a glory. "Who is it?" he asked, putting his hands over her eyes. "Oh!" cried Peggy, dropping her pen and removing his hands. "The only man who would dare to take such a liberty with me. Miles, my darling pig," and she kissed him, laughing. "I don't like the last word, Peggy." "It's Papa Le Beau's favorite word with his pupils," said Peggy, who always spoke of the dancing master thus. "With the addition of darling?" "No, that is an addition of my own, but I can remove it if you like." "I don't like," said Miles, sitting down and pulling her towards him. "Come and talk to me, Pegtop." "I won't be called Pegtop, and as to talking, I have far too much work to do. The lesson will be soon over, and some of the pupils have to take these accounts home. Then déjeuner will be ready, and you know how Margot hates having her well cooked dishes spoilt by waiting. But why are you here instead of at work?" "Hush," said Miles, laying a finger on her lips. "Papa will hear you." "Not he. Hear the noise his fiddle is making, and he is scolding the poor little wretches like a gamecock." "Does a gamecock scold?" asked Jennings gravely. "I hope he is not in a bad temper, Peggy. I have come to ask him a few questions." "About your own business?" she asked in a lower tone. Jennings nodded. Peggy knew his occupation, but as yet he had not been able to tell Le Beau. The Frenchman cherished all the traditional hatred of his race for the profession of mouchard, and would not be able to understand that a detective was of a higher standing. Miles was therefore supposed to be a gentleman of independent fortune, and both he and Peggy decided to inform Le Beau of the truth when he had retired from business. Meanwhile, Miles often talked over his business with Peggy, and usually found her clear way of looking at things of infinite assistance to him in the sometimes difficult cases which he dealt with. Peggy knew all about the murder in Crooked Lane, and how Miles was dealing with the matter. But even she had not been able to suggest a clue to the assassin, although she was in full possession of the facts. "It's about this new case I wish to speak," said Jennings. "By the way, Peggy, do you know that woman Maraquito I have talked of?" "Yes, the gambling house. What of her?" "Well, she seems to be implicated in the matter." "In what way?" Jennings related the episode of the photograph and the incident of the same perfume being used by Mrs. Herne and Maraquito. Peggy nodded. "I don't see how the photograph connects her with the case," she said at length, "but the same perfume certainly is strange. All the same, the scent may be fashionable. Haiku. Haiku. I have never heard of it. It is a Japanese perfume, and Maraquito got it from some foreign admirer. It is strange, as you say." "Have you seen Mrs. Herne?" "I saw her at the inquest. She gave evidence, but I had no conversation with her myself." "Why don't you look her up? You mentioned you had her address." "I haven't it now," said Jennings gloomily. "I called at the Hampstead house and learned that Mrs.